what I do know from having treated over 100 people who've committed acts of rape and murder is that they've come from an environment during childhood where they were physically abused, emotionally neglected, and often sexually abused. And that's pretty typical of people who commit these kinds of offences. I've never met a man who committed an act of rape or murder who was raised within a loving family where they felt safe and protected. What you typically see is people who have been traumatized very early on in life, and so they've learned to disconnect from their emotional selves, and they struggle to manage feelings like sadness or shame or fear. And what they do instead is they pour that into feelings of anger and aggression, which allow them to feel more powerful. And I think it's significant that the police culture is a culture that requires people to switch off and disconnect from their emotions. So whilst I don't think the police culture caused a police officer to commit an act of rape, I do think that the police culture probably enabled Mr. Couzens to maintain his fantasies and not be challenged about inappropriate attitudes towards women. In over 20 years of working with men who commit crimes like rape and murder, I've never once met a single individual who wasn't the victim of abuse and neglect during childhood himself. So we're talking about really high levels of abuse and neglect. 66% have been sexually abused, many of those also by women, over 70% physically abused, and 80% emotionally neglected. These are the real causes of rape and murder, and prison cannot address that. People will want to come and work in those organisations because they see an opportunity to abuse and exploit vulnerable others, and particularly when the organisation carries a degree of power and responsibility for well-being within society. So police, education, religious bodies. Within organisations such as these, there needs to be a culture where it's accepted that some people will be joining because they want to abuse and rape other people. And to safeguard against that, they need to make it possible to have open conversations about feelings, that people are able to talk about their suspicions about their colleagues rather than things get brushed under the carpet. And we know that Mr. Couzens, his reputation was, his nickname was the rapist. So people were concerned about Mr. Couzens within the police. The government's announced that it wants to build more prison places. If this government's really serious about cutting serious crime, it would be far better to treat the root cause of the problem, not the symptoms. And that involves investment in children and families and making sure children feel safe and loved. So the phrase toxic masculinity gets used a lot these days. Personally, I really don't like it. I think when we use a phrase like toxic masculinity, it's almost like we're saying males are toxic. And I would have quite a strong reaction if people were to start talking about toxic femininity, for instance. Ultimately, I think when we gender emotional illiteracy, which I think is what's happening with toxic masculinity, then we end up painting women into the box of being victims and men into the box of being perpetrators. And I think that makes it very difficult for men to talk about their feelings that leave them feeling emotionally vulnerable. And ultimately, that's what drives suicide, is people's emotional pain and not being able to express it.